इसको थोड़ा सा प्लग इन कर देते हैं। I don't know why they made this so difficult. So why couldn't get it so difficult?
Yes. You talk about the limit.
This is not. मुझे लगता है इसके साथ हम लोग कहीं भी आ सकते हैं। सब फिर इसमें एक छोटा सा विंडो आएगा। ठीक है।
तो उसका लिंक
couldn't open that, but someone had sent me a photograph, so I put that in my LinkedIn. I made a Facebook post.
3 बजे शुरू 3 to 4 कुछ खाया अपने आस पास जो फीड्स
Actually, yes, I'm disturbing you. You can't use this. You can use this chair.
What?
You just sit. You could even get the use for it. Was it weird meeting everybody?
Not really. Fine. बढ़िया. किस चीज के लिए? हाँ वो अच्छा 3,000 रुपये बोले 4,500 अच्छा लगेगा तो अच्छा बट ज्यादा ना हो जाए. Can they do every alternate check? बहुत ज्यादा होना है राशि. the शादी टाइप का क्योंकि रन भी स्ट्रॉन्ग है. हाँ तो या तो उसको बोलो थोड़ा शेयर करे कलर उसका पिक्चर. हाँ अगर हल्का कलर है तो दे दो. हाँ that will be fine. हाँ हाँ तो देखिए जो श्रुति आई थी जो भी नाम था रवि का वो पहली बार आई है तो उसको विजिटर बता सकते हैं. राहुल पहले भी आ चुका है तो उसको आप ऑब्जर्वर भी रखो. And the lady can be taken. There's no problem. हाँ एक को ले लो. इसके वैसे भी विजिटर आते नहीं है. एक उसको क्रेडिट ही मिलता है. अच्छा एक मैंने आपको स्क्रीनशॉट भेजा था ग्रुप पे जो थोड़ी देर पहले डाला जो वहां से आई थी प्रणव की मेल आई. तो वो काफी सारे लोगों को क्रेडिट दे रहा है विजिटर्स का जो कि उन्होंने दूसरे चैप्टर में इनवाइट किया. या उनको दे देना.
Paper? Printer paper?
हाँ इसमें नहीं वो सब देने की जरूरत है. क्रेडिट आप उसमें नहीं नंबर नहीं दे सकते. ये तो ऑलरेडी एंटर हो चुका है. हाँ बस यार जस्ट नंबर्स ऐड करने. हाँ ठीक है सर. ओके जी थैंक यू. I might have a pen.
Not bad, which is anything to scribble things on.
हाँ जी सर. I know. I'm not really sure. Usually देते तो नहीं है credit. वो शायद अगली बार आने वाला है, अगले हफ्ते. तो अगली बार पैसे मत लेना आप. इसका वो नहीं किया था ना, हमने पैसे नहीं दिए थे. अच्छा. But we didn't pay for him to the hotel. No? Breakfast तो नहीं किया था ना इसने. अच्छा. तो फिर आप ऐसा करो, इसको आज मत देना, उसको बोल देना कि वो दोबारा बुला के ले आए. हाँ, तो पैसे मत लेना.
I think we've got 13 or 14 people logged in already. For those who have logged in, welcome.
Yeah, we still have 5 minutes.
I can still see, yeah, I know we have 5 minutes. We have 6 minutes, but we have some people logging in already. Bhagat, I've sent you a message.
Then this the working, you need to either sit or be, so you're working from an end.
I would go in and out.
novels. Some media. Absolutely.
We've got 2 minutes to go, and I think we've got about 20 people, including us, so about 20 attendees in, but we still have a lot more to go. 2 minutes more, ladies and gentlemen. Countdown of the final minute, just 1 minute more to go, and then we'll start. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second webinar in the series of 6 webinars that we have organized as part of the WINGS program. As you know, the NCR chapter of NHRD had created a networking program called Women Inspired to Network, Grow and Shine, which is WINGS, which consists of 4 panel sessions on 2 different days, the first of which is over. You would have heard Dr. Shalini Lal there as well and got to see her. And now we get to hear her. So the first webinar is over. This is the second webinar, which is about building a career in a world that is new. And our next panel session will be on 17th April at the same venue. For today's panel, we are very, very happy to have the very reputed speaker, very reputed HR professional that we have a lot of respect for, Dr. Shalini Lal. Dr. Shalini Lal today runs her own company called Infinity OD, being an OD specialist. She is from IIM Ahmedabad and one of the rare people who chose organizational development as her specialization. She began working and with one of her senior positions at Airtel, where she was head of OD. At that point of time, she decided to do her Ph.D. at UCLA in organizational change. She has also held leadership positions with Escorts and Deutsche Bank and is today a consultant in the field of OD and a coach to major leaders and senior CHROs. She was also a participant at the Wharton School's Global Fellows in Talent program in the year 2018. And it is indeed a privilege for her to talk to us because she helps build leadership capability and culture for organizations that are genuinely interested in their future. So without much ado, over to Dr. Shalini Lal. You can collect your questions and please put them into the chat box. We have someone who will be then collecting those questions, and those questions will then be answered towards the end of the 1 hour. However, feel free to put your questions up now itself. So over to you, Shalini, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mamta. Thank you so much. Am I clear? Audible?
Yes, a little louder volume would help, but you are audible.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here talking about what it means to build a career in a world that is changing so fast. One of the reasons why I wanted to speak about this was that a lot of the work I do is about helping organizational leaders make sense of a world that's changing so fast. So while I'm working with organizational leaders to make sense of this, world that surprised perhaps all of us with its pace of change, I thought it would just make perfect sense to bring this in for what its implications are going to be for careers. So thank you so much, Mamta, for having me over in this session on behalf of WINGS. While, of course, this is part of WINGS, I do want to add that everything we speak about is actually absolutely gender neutral. So this is going to be applicable for careers, men's careers, women's careers, and actually for all of us. So let me just start off. Mamta's already introduced me, so I won't speak much more about this, except to say that if you are thinking about, what are some of the ways in which you can build a strong career, there's a book which me and my co-author Pradnya had written, and I understand that Pradnya had led the last webinar. So, how lucky are we? So if you have any questions about, what it takes to build a strong organizational career, I think we've tried our best to answer a lot of these questions. What I'm going to speak about today, however, is, more broadly, what changes? What is the reason why we're having a discussion like this today? Why would this discussion, in a sense, have been very different maybe 5 years ago, which isn't really all that long ago, but 5 years ago, perhaps many of these topics wouldn't have been as much in focus as they are today. So we're going to talk about what some of the macro trends are, what are the big changes that we're seeing now that are still fairly new, and changes that all of us are in some sense just wrapping our heads around. Then we're going to talk about what this is going to mean for careers from here on. And finally, we're going to look at what you can do to build a strong career when the world in which you're building a career is changing just so dramatically. So let me start by this discussion on what changes in the future. Now, one of my favorite stories is actually the story around the game of chess. So some of you might know that the game of chess was actually invented in India. And the story is that the game of chess was actually invented in Gujarat. It was invented because the king was a king apparently called Sasu, was very upset by the fact that a lot of people in his kingdom were busy gambling, sleeping, drinking, and really not up to what he considered productive work. So he asked someone, one of the wise men in his kingdom, if he could design a game that would actually get people, thinking and force them to use their mind. So a wise man came up with the game of chess, and as you can imagine, the game was meant for what would delight a king of the time. So it has all the fanfare of the king and the queen, and the army and strategy, etc., etc. Not surprisingly, the king Sasu was really happy and asked this wise man, what do you want in exchange for your wonderful gift? So now this wise man was truly very wise. So what he asked for was, all I want is you to give me a few grains of rice or wheat, and but I want them placed a particular way. And you start with 1 in the first square, then double it to 2 and 4, and so on. And when the king hears this the first time, he's actually a little surprised, because his experience was that when he made these generous offers to people, asking them to ask for whatever they wanted, this was not what they asked for. So, of course, very readily he agrees and says, yes, absolutely. Except that when his ministers start doing a calculation, they are absolutely shocked by the number that they come up with. Now, this number is so large that it's hard for me to even read out, but to give you a sense of what this means, it's more than the global wheat production in 2014. So, and 1,645 times the global wheat production in 2014. You can just about imagine how far out of reach this would have been for a small kingdom in Gujarat set, many hundreds of years ago. So obviously, when the king realizes what his inventor has asked for, he gets very upset. But part of the story goes that the king wants to keep his word, and he goes bankrupt in the process of trying to fulfill his promise. The other story is that he has the inventor beheaded. Now you can decide which of these is true, but the key takeaway is that what we get from something as simple as 1 grain on the first square, then 2, then 4, is a pile that's higher than Mount Everest. The reason I bring this up is because this kind of scaling up represents a change that we haven't in human history really seen before. And it's the exponential curve. I know all of us study it sometime in our maths in 9th or 10th, and most often it's just a sum to be solved, and it doesn't really mean anything to us. But this is where we seem to be in terms of the progress of technology. There are actually a number of technology-based laws which follow the exact same curve as the exponential curve, and therefore are counterintuitive. So one of the reasons why the king has such a hard time wrapping his head around just how much grain the inventor asks him is because it isn't intuitive. All of us see change that's linear, or we can think linearly, but thinking exponentially is such a different it's such a different being that there haven't been too many times in history where we've faced this. But many futurists now are saying that we are exactly in one such time in human history, perhaps the first where technology has brought about such rapid changes. And I'm sure you've by now heard the word Fourth Industrial Revolution everywhere. What happens is that there are 30 technologies of the next decade that are coming together. And while each of these technologies is transformational,
excuse me, in its own way. What makes this so different is that they all can speak to each other. And because they can speak to each other, possibilities that just did not exist a few years ago exist today. So this is why everything changes. The kind of worlds that we have inherited, and very often our own ideas of careers that we've inherited based on what we've seen people in the past live through, just won't hold tomorrow, because businesses and organizations themselves are going to have to be designed so differently from any time in the past that the same model of linear kind of career paths that were very popular, very prevalent for the last couple of decades will exist for a smaller and smaller number of people. And a lot of it is driven by technology. It's also driven by globalization and the fact that today no individual organization really has a choice on whether it wishes to adopt some of these new technologies or not. The business imperative itself is so strong that for their own survival, this really becomes table stakes. So we are going to see organizations around the world think of new ways to use any combination of these technologies to both offer new services to their customers and clients, but also organize themselves very, very differently on the inside. And for the first time, therefore, we are, as a human civilization, facing a time where many of the skills that we have, prized really ourselves on, like our ability to think and our ability to do many of the white collar kind of work are now going to be under a lot of pressure with some of these technologies. So here are some of what the Pew Research Center, which is one of the most globally renowned centers, really estimates as the timeline for artificial intelligence. And just the other day, by the way, I myself was surprised. I came across a video of a rapper called Travis Scott, and some of you might be familiar with Travis Scott's work, except that the video, the entire song, the music arrangement, and even the video that accompanied it was made by AI. And frankly, it sounded pretty nice. So AI is entering our world in a way that's going to disrupt us in ways that really were unthinkable. To give you a little bit of sense, about 3 years ago when I started studying this area and started conducting research on what is this going to mean for some specific functions, and actually the first one I started was the human resource function. What is automation and technology going to mean for human resources? You may find it hard to believe, but I visited many business schools and asked business school faculty if they would like to partner with me in that research. And just 3 years ago, many of them said that this was a little ahead of its time. Today, it sounds almost laughable because this is changing our worlds as we speak. So really, this is some of the context within which we're talking about careers that are starting now. These changes are very different from anything that we've experienced in the past. The primary reason is that so far, all the industrial revolutions that have preceded this have never so directly competed with the abilities that we consider human. And therefore, while physical, mechanical labor went away, or even data processing and many of the repetitive tasks went away, we haven't so far had any technologies that have come as close as tomorrow's technologies are coming to the kind of work that we as people do. So that's really behind the cataclysmic changes, shall I say, around the world, and what the fourth industrial revolution is going to mean for the entire business and organizational world. So let's then come to what this will mean for careers. And I'm sure some of the data I show you is familiar because a lot of this data is just doing the rounds. The World Economic Forum keeps putting out a lot of these studies. So some might be a little familiar. Some of the global consulting companies are also putting out their own research on this every 2 or 3 months. And by the way, they're all good. So if you're interested, follow the World Economic Forum. There's lots of content on their website. And if you're interested, you can go to, frankly, every global consulting company's website and do a search around future of work, future of jobs, and you'll see tons of data around which professions are likely to be impacted, how much, which geography, etc., etc. So for the details of how technological progress is expected to impact specific professions, specific skills, and specific geographies, visit some of these websites. There's tons and tons of data out there, and it might be interesting. But here are some data points to get started. So most of 2030's jobs apparently haven't been invented yet. And this is really, this article isn't all that far back, and you might have heard this data point being mentioned many, many times. And that's because it comes backed with a lot of research around, Institute for the Future, but also ratified by many of the other global futurists. The reason for that is that the way technologies are coming together, they're throwing up surprises for us each day. And therefore, along with the surprising products and offerings that these technologies provide, side by side sit the newer professions. So just as an example, I spoke a little while ago about this whole Travis Scott video, which was created by AI. You can imagine that creating music using AI might be another profession that is emerging, or for that matter, you might be surprised, or maybe not, that just the way we have been used to people walking the ramp, like fashion models walking the ramp and showing off latest collections of different labels, today there are digital models who can do that. So that opens up this whole new field of creating digital models who would operate in many ways just like fashion models, because for most people, your content is consumed through the screen. Those who perhaps attend a live fashion show are a much smaller part of the audience for any of the fashion labels. So see, that's an example of new industries and new jobs that are being created. But our expectation globally is that so many such new avenues are going to open out that most of 2030's jobs haven't been invented yet. According to this data point, 85% of the jobs that today's college students will work in 11 years haven't been invented yet. So that's really a sense of how fluid the situation is and how many surprises are in store for all people who are beginning their careers now. Now, here's another data point, that today's students will have 8 to 10 jobs by the time they are 38. Now, really, that's, maybe sitting in India, it isn't even that surprising, given that so many young people, in any case, move jobs or organizations. But what will make this more interesting is that the nature of jobs themselves will keep shifting, because organizations will move, organizations themselves will not stay constant, or rather will stay constant for such short durations of time that jobs in their traditional manner and career hierarchies, job families in the traditional manner, like all of us in HR used to speak about, maybe just a decade ago, that model itself starts coming under strain. So according to the World Economic Forum, just to give you a sense, a skill which could last you about 30 years is now expected to last you just 6 years. So that gives another sense of the fluidity and the expectation for change being, just so much more pervasive. 35% of core skills change between 2015 and 2020. And, we're living this. This is not even something that is that far in the horizon. Of course, when so much is changing in the outside world, it means that for any of us, just to stay relevant in whichever profession we are, managing learning itself becomes, almost another job. So World Economic Forum puts out this data point that by 2022, everyone will need an extra 101 days of learning. This is, of course, based on their Future of Jobs report in 2018. So in a sense, this maps to about 25 extra days of learning for each person a year. Now, that's really quite a lot. Whenever I've shared this with people, particularly young people, the first thing they tell us is, where are we supposed to find that time? And I don't know, there isn't a very easy answer to this, but it gives a sense of just how large a priority learning becomes. When I speak to people who are, say, around my age, who've been, in careers for 20, 30 years, one of the things I'm finding is that some, not at all, but some, and actually I would say now many, people who are really at the cutting edge of their professions are finding space for a tremendous amount of relearning in their professions. And they're going about this in a variety of ways. There's so much learning available online. I think all of us are large consumers of online learning. I know I am, and I know many other of my peers are. But then you combine that with executive programs, with learning by, visiting other organizations which are doing cutting edge stuff, or participating in networks, forums, and discussions just like this. And that gives you a sense of, the many, many different ways in which each of us will need to engage with a fast changing world just to stay relevant. So then, of course, is the reality that part of what we're likely to see over the next decade or so is widespread automation. And this automation becomes a reality simply because artificial intelligence combines with all the other technologies that I showed you in the other page to be able to start taking over some of the work that people do. So as a data point, in India, this is the expectation. This is all work in millions. So by 2030, this is the millions of full-time employees who might potentially be displaced. So that's really going to be the impact of automation. This is not something that we've seen in the past. In the past, we saw manual labor be replaced by machines, particularly in those countries where, with smaller populations and where labor costs were a bit higher. And that's why work came to countries like India with large populations, with lower labor costs. India was a great beneficiary in many ways of the last wave, the last industrial revolution with the computer age or the internet age. And many of our computer companies really rode that wave to give widespread employment, widespread jobs, etc., etc. That's likely to change now with the fourth industrial revolution. Some of this is actually not very good news as well, because it does put a lot of pressure on the job situation in our country. And according to a World Bank report, for instance, India would have to grow at a pace of 10% year on year for the next 20 years to maintain its current rates of employment. So that's really gives you a sense of how large the challenge is and why it means that many of the mental models we've used in the past for building a career are really going to come under strain. And in fact, if I were to talk, absolutely clearly, I think they'll be applicable to increasingly smaller number of people. Many people will find that those worlds will be very hard to stay in, simply because organizations themselves are going to face so much pressure to be leaner. Again, some stats on expectations, and if you see just as a share of hours spent, 2025, which is really not all that far away, the expectation is that about half of the work that is being done human-machine combined will now move over to machines. So obviously this has meant a great deal of career anxiety all over the world. Yesterday I was reading the Financial Times, and it just spoke about how when they spoke to some of the counselors in leading universities like Oxford University, they're also reporting that far more students are coming to understand how should we build our careers, because I think the fact that many of the mental models and maybe many of our expectations from the past are not going to hold. Of course, for people who are young and entering the workforce now, this is also challenging, because maybe in your family and in your parents may have expectations from what they saw. My kids are in the workforce now. So I can say this, that when I started my career in the early 90s, we really rode the wave of Indian liberalization and the third industrial revolution, and jobs were really plenty. I think there was a time, at least in the late 90s, early 2000s, maybe about a decade or so, when so long as you weren't bad at what you did, you would do well. It was, there was just so much of a talent demand. Now, all that, of course, is going to change, and it is, showing up as a lot of career anxiety. At the same time, studies that talk about people who are in regular jobs, the jobs that are often so prized, show that somewhere they aren't satisfying us. So even the jobs that maybe sound very exciting, and like Mamta's held many of them, and frankly, so have I, jobs that a lot of people would maybe think are deeply, deeply meaningful, have a meaningful component, but not always. So even traditional career forms are coming into strain, because somewhere they aren't fulfilling people in quite the same way as they used to in the past. Perhaps our own expectations as people, have changed quite a bit. So even when there's a sense that, yeah, this is a great job, that hasn't been as fulfilling. So then let's come to really the question that, so what does this mean to build a strong career from here on? So as a point of contrast, let me start by what it meant 2 or 3 decades ago, or frankly, even 10 years ago. For many people, the idea was that, you would enter an organization which had a big name, and you would make your way up the career ladder. Of course, all of that is easier in an economy that's expanding and a situation where more people are needed. Today, we aren't at such a place. Our economic growth has slowed down considerably, but also because of the pressure which technology is putting, there is a great pressure on organizations to be as lean as possible. And that has meant that organizations are designing themselves very differently from any time in the past. So I know I've given so many data points, but here's one which always stays in my mind, because it's representative of what we might see happen in a lot of organizations from here on. So I'm sure all of us are consumers of Netflix. We all watch Netflix in our spare time. And Netflix is today a $16 billion company. It's one of the biggest global companies, and it hires only about 5,000 people. So, that's really what the new form of organization is going to look like. Technology enabled, with a small core, which is very agile and perhaps designed a little more simply than the past, and a much larger periphery of individual agents, smaller organizations, whom they work with to be able to produce the content that they do on such a large and global scale. Now, of course, that's Netflix. It's also true of, say, Spotify. It's also true of, Craigslist. So we're seeing that a lot of organizations that are being born in the last decade, and perhaps those that are being born from here on, because they primarily position themselves as tech companies which do something. So tech company which does, say, content creation, or music or movies, or a tech company which does transportation like an Uber, or so on. their inclination is to have far fewer number of employees than what the same job would have really required in the past. And it's not only cost control, although cost is a very important part of it. It's also the need to be able to shift and move according to what the market says. And the larger an organization is, and particularly if it has its own, large bureaucracies like large banks of the past have had, or even today have, movement becomes really hard. So we've seen almost all global banks announce some form of downsizing. I think last week was HSBC announcing 35,000 jobs globally. We're likely to see more and more of that, simply because the pressure to stay competitive when newer forms of organizations are so tech focused that the older, more labor intensive, more bureaucratic organization sees itself at being, strongly disadvantaged. So for that reason, the careers as we thought of them in the past, they're not really going to be there for too many people. Maybe they will be there for some people. They definitely will be there for some people, but not as plentiful as they were in the past. So, when I was preparing for this webinar and when we were doing the research for our own book, we were looking at, what does it mean now to build a career now? And I think one of the ways that I can describe it best is to really have liquid careers. And why the word liquid? Because, one of the characteristics of liquid is that it adapts to the circumstances it finds itself in. So it takes its shape based on, what's happening in the outside environment. So liquid careers then would be those careers that can quickly adapt to changing environments. So in a sense, this would be, on the one hand, a series of work assignments that leverage your inherent interests, skills, experience, but are also constantly adapting and changing. Adapting because the environment is changing, and also adapting because you yourself will change. As you go through your career, you'll discover things about yourself that will be surprises. You'll find there are things you love to do that you had no idea of, and that there are things that you thought you would enjoy, but actually that doesn't turn out to be the case. So maybe the best way to look at what might careers in the future, good careers in the future, look like would be to just keep the example of liquid in mind and liquid careers. But this then, because it's so different from the kind of career models many of us have had in the past, will need a completely new way of looking at careers. And that will need both a good understanding of you, your interests, your talents, along with a good understanding of what the world needs at any given time. And this is important because, with a world which is so fluid and so changing so fast, this whole connection between what's on the inside, what's happening on the outside, what's happening on the inside, what's happening on the outside, it's a very dynamic connection, and it's one which will keep changing maybe every few years. Now, for some people who are hearing that might be a really thrilling, thought that, okay, we're going to have so many different careers and we're going to be able to do so many things in one lifetime. And that's wonderful. I think it'll really suit some people very, very well. They're going to enjoy this. Many others might find this a little daunting and find, wish that we could go back to simpler times when you just sort of joined one company, put your head down, did the work, and then the organization would look after you, and then you'd move to a similar organization, similar role, but a bigger one, bigger title, and so on, and then you'd spend 30 years and then you'd retire. We don't know how many people will ever get that opportunity now. I think there will be a small set, but it'll be a pretty small set. So everything does change. This capacity to keep evolving and changing based on what is going to come up your way is going to be key in a way that wasn't in the past. You know, when I speak with HR people, for instance, a lot of the talent planning we used to do, let me say, put myself as well, talent planning, career planning, used to be based on saying that, okay, in role X, at this level of the organization, you know, these are the key competencies. And then to move to role Y, this will be the new set of competencies. So over the next 3 years, 4 years, you know, this is the gap that you have to meet. Now with X also changing and Y also changing, that becomes a much, much harder thing to predict. So, you know, the kind of fluidity that careers are going to need tomorrow are of a completely different order from anything which our generation had so far experienced. Of course, people like me and Mamta and many others who are, you know, still have many decades ahead in our career, we are also doing the whole work of evolving ourselves in ways that perhaps we ourselves hadn't quite known. So now, having said all of this, what then might be a good place to start? And I'm going to refer to a book that I personally find really helpful. And I'll come to the book a little later, but it's about designing your life. And therefore, the best place to start is having a compass inside of what will feel right to you. What kinds of jobs will feel, what kinds of careers, what kinds of areas of interest feel right to you. And then using that compass to continuously scan the environment and build your skills according to what is coming up in the environment. So the book that I was speaking of was called Designing Your Life. And oops, it's a step-by-step, sorry. It's a step-by-step process for you know, looking at what work means. What I love about this book is that it's written by 2 design thinking professors at Stanford, and it therefore really takes, you know, the underlying assumption is we don't necessarily know the answers to many things. We need to know what are the questions that we're working with, and then we need to keep those questions live and search for answers. So rather than expecting that anyone, you know, say in their early 20s just knows what they want to do and what kind of work will be satisfying for them, let's do a little bit of introspection, but then let's go out and experience different parts of the world and see whether we connect with that kind of work or we don't. So the starting point in, you know, in this way of looking at a career is really what matters to you about your work and where does it fit into your life. And of course, this is a broad question, but it's like the big questions, you know, the super big questions that maybe sometimes we can go through our entire career without asking. But given the fact that you're going to be in the driver's seat of your career in a much more active way than, you know, people needed to in the past, having those answers will just make you a much better navigator for yourself. So you'll be able to have a much better sense of what kinds of careers are going to suit you, what kind of work is going to suit you, what will leave you deeply satisfied. So take a look at the book. It's a really good book. Here are some of the questions it speaks about. It speaks about taking a look at, you know, in your life, what are some of the big things, your own understanding of what's a life well lived, what should be part of a life well lived, and then locating the work that you do within that life and saying, okay, so I would like my work to mean A, B, C. And then using both your work view and your life view to create a compass for yourself that will help you navigate. And the reason for this is that as the outside is changing so dramatically and so fast, you know, it's like when you're in the wild, what do you need? You need a compass. You need a compass to show you whether you're headed in the right direction or not. And some of these questions give you that internal compass. The book also speaks about the importance of experiences and how, you know, one of the only ways in which you're going to get a sense of whether a particular kind of work suits you or not is to be very mindful about what happens on the inside when you do something. So for instance, you might discover that, I might discover that when I'm doing my writing work, so I am a writer as well, I feel a certain way. Like I feel, honest truth is I feel deeply engaged and deeply energized. So that's an indication that, writing probably should be part of my, career set. Similarly, whatever it is that you do in your day, make a note of all the different things you do in your day at work, because they'll be fairly varied. There'll be so many things within that. And then try and think about, how engaged you feel when you do something, how energized you feel, and then use some of these findings to make sense of, therefore, what should you, what really brings you joy? What brings you joy in your life? And then what should you do to design your life so that, there are more moments of that? Now, I realize that this is, in some ways, sounds almost very unconventional, but just think about it. In a time when things are going to be changing so rapidly, and the standard, regular, neatly cut jobs are going to become fewer and fewer. Think of, on the one hand, if you're looking for the model of the past, that's a bit disappointing that that won't exist. But on the other hand, it can be hugely liberating, because it means that if not that, you have the space to design a career that truly meets many different aspects of you. By the way, the IIM Women's Network, we have like a small group, and I myself am amazed at how, many of the younger women who graduated in the last decade or so are already following this. Many of them have portfolio careers where they are doing many, many different things at one time. Again, these were things which maybe were daunting in the past, but given the enabling nature of technology, much more also becomes possible. So, technology is always a double-edged sword. On the one hand, automation will put pressure on standard jobs. At the same time, if you are inventive and if you're entrepreneurial, then it gives you scale at a level that, nothing did in the past. So what are the meta skills for the future? Now, you may have come across some of these discussions earlier. Very often people speak about things like complex problem solving, communication, influence, creativity, systems thinking, and it's true. If you look at skills as a T, where the deep end is, a deep area of expertise that you have, then some of the additional skills that you will need to be able to move from one kind of job to the other will be skills that translate across many different contexts. And some of the skills listed here are exactly that kind: complex problem solving, communication, influence, creativity, systems thinking. But also you will need skills that allow you to keep learning. So, learning to learn is a big one. Personal reinvention is a big one. Even understanding what's happening in the outside world. What are the trends that you can work with to, build a career around? Those are many of the key skills. Again, these are new key skills. They were not as important earlier on. I realize it does require actually a dramatically different belief system. In the earlier model of careers, we sort of imagined that we had to fit into a box, and if we did whatever that role asked us to, from there on, somehow the organization would, or maybe a series of organizations would take care of our career. But because those boxes are going to keep changing their shape, that earlier model doesn't hold. So therefore, the new belief system requires actually a much deeper sense of knowing what you can do. So I say, it's like, yes, I can. And many of us sometimes have to build up to, really have that kind of faith. If I'm honest, I know I have spent many years deepening that understanding that, yes, I can do many things. And along with that, just this absolute hunger for learning and knowing that whatever you know today it's only relevant in a particular context for a particular time. Maybe parts of that are going to be relevant in another context, but it's difficult to say. So that hunger for learning is at a whole other level. Because continuous reskilling becomes a must. Now, I think you might feel I'm getting a little repetitive, but the fact is this is really at the heart of it. Earlier we imagined we'd go to school, we'd go to college, we'd finish our learning, and then we'd go to work. And at work we would apply all that we'd learned, get more experience, move on to a bigger role, and so on. All that's completely changed. The new model of learning is just way more self-directed because nobody else today can take that kind of ownership. Now, of course, it's a joy, and it can be also maybe a little bit disorienting for some. So it is a time for self-directed learning, for learning through experimentation, seeing what has worked, what has not worked, and course corrections. And the tighter these loops of, learning reflection, the faster you're learning. And if you've done any learning around learning, you might be aware of how some of these learning action reflection loops themselves work. So as I said, our own skills, what are the skills that are going to be helpful in the future? We can take a guess at it. And I spoke a little bit about the skills and knowledge, partly the skills which transcend different contexts and the skills which are about learning and reinvention on the one hand. But what will allow us to do that? Now, I'm actually a big fan of the whole field of positive psychology. And I'm a fan because it gives us insights into what mental states allow us to navigate uncertainty and what mental states allow us to navigate difficult situations. And at the heart of it lies optimism, hope, personal resilience. I used to think actually that these are things that we were born with, or we picked up from our family, but practicing frankly on myself and people close to me first, and now with people I coach, I realized that that's not true. Actually, we each have the capacity for a lot more optimism, hope, resilience than sometimes we are aware of. But they're very foundationally important mental states for us going ahead, because in their absence, we might find ourselves overwhelmed by the amount of change and might find it hard to see opportunities that others who are, with some of these positive mental states can see far more readily. I'm also going to refer you to a few resources that I thought are really, really good. So take a look at them. Here's one, Armenia Ibarra. She teaches at London Business School. She's done great work on careers. Take a look at her book on working identity. She speaks about the fact that, once again, many of us don't know how we will actually interact with the situation till we are in it. So she speaks about when you think a particular career option is a good one for you, how can you devise little experiments that will give you a better and better sense of whether your hypothesis that this kind of career, family, or whatever is for you is actually true. So take a look at some of her work. For those of you who will at some point become entrepreneurs, either self-employed or with small organizations, here's another good book. It's about the entrepreneurial view, and it speaks about how to develop a portfolio of interests that you can monetize and will give you multiple income streams and allow you to, in a sense, have a designer career. So that's another good book. In prep for this webinar, actually, I took a look at what some of the leaders are speaking about today. And here's Ariana Huffington's post, and you can see she's saying exactly the same thing. The best strategy is to be endlessly adaptable and endlessly flexible. Embrace change as the only constant. Professor Eric, and I don't know how to pronounce this, at the MIT Sloan School says that focus on those skills which humans do much better than machines. So that's like creativity, entrepreneurship, interpersonal skills, persuasion, motivation, nurturing, because those will at least be under less pressure from automation. And the second piece of advice he gives, which is really helpful, is that since the kind of area we are entering, there'll be a small number of people who will really rise to the top and will have huge amounts of success. It's practically very difficult to be really at the top of your profession unless you truly enjoy what you do. So that whole piece we spoke about in liquid careers, that start from a deep understanding of what is satisfying for you and then move from there on, that's really helpful as you design your career. Professor Linda Grattan, she speaks about remaining alert to what the next valuable skills are. Once again, the fact that education, work, retirement, as we thought about it, it's outdated. That model will not exist for people who are starting off now. And the importance of experimentation. And, think of it as a career that will see, like a portfolio, many different experiences over a lifetime. So what do you want in your portfolio that will give you most joy? And finally, Martin Ford, he's written this really fascinating book around what future technology brings. And he speaks about something very similar to what another professor spoke about, that there are roles which are perhaps not so easy to automate. And those are the roles where maybe we're going to see a lot more demand. So that's his advice. Think of what's not going to be automated easily and work on maybe the softer skills. To me, it's very interesting that the softer skills, which 20 years ago were really sort of laughed at, that the HR skills, the interpersonal, persuasion, influence, leadership, etc., now land up being the key skills, because it's going to be a while before machines are able to take them over. So it's really interesting how the world has gone around full circle. Here's a giveaway for anyone who's interested. I had put out on LinkedIn this 60 slider on how to build a strong career within any organization a couple of days ago. You can either go to my LinkedIn page and download it from there, or if you like, you send me an email at shalini@infinityod.com and I will send you a copy of that. That gives you a whole lot of tips about what it takes to build a successful career within an organization. So for the duration when that's a key area of focus, that might be something of help to you. So with that, I'm going to come to an end of the presentation. I realize we only have a few minutes left. Let me end by saying that the changing world does mean a lot of opportunities for all of us. The only thing that's different is that we need a much higher degree of self-ownership for our careers than any time in the past, because it's beyond the capacity of either the organization we are working with or any set of organizations to really do it for us. That's on the one hand super exciting, super fascinating. On the other hand, if your mental model is stuck with what was in the past, it can also be extremely scary. So that's really where we are. And one last thing, if you want to know more, I do write a column for Mint. I speak about what leadership is going to look like in a very fast changing world. You can either check out my column online, or I write on alternate Wednesdays. So today was this article right here. So you can read that and get maybe, if you find that interesting, some sense of where leadership is headed. With that, let me end, and maybe we have time for a couple of questions. So I see a question by Naren. how do I know my own mental models or my learning agility? Well, that's actually the two are different things, by the way. The two are very different things, your own mental models. And so I think a great way to, maybe a good way to map what your mental models are is just think of how you expect the world to unfold. And maybe ask yourself, where did this expectation come from? And does it hold anymore? So let me give an example. Sometimes I go to universities to give a talk, and I find that, many university professors, for instance, because their world hasn't changed all that much, right? They pass on the model of careers to their students even today that was relevant 20 years ago. So maybe just like, what are your expectations from your career? Think about that and think about where those expectations develop from. Was it because that's what you saw in your family? Is it something else? Reality is all of us are carrying mental models from the past because that's how they develop. It's how quickly we're able to understand that they're rooted in the past and how quickly we are, actively focused on redesigning them that will sort of determine how current they are. And it's not easy. It does take a lot of work. I try and work on this, and I can tell you my kids are always making fun of me because they think my mental models are still outdated. So I don't know if, if it's very easy to, completely solve for this. Any other questions? Okay, Mamta, can I hand it back to you then?
Yes, of course. I found this extremely informative for me personally, and I'm sure everyone will realize as they go through your profile and read up a little more how privileged it was for all of us to have heard you. Ladies and gentlemen, there are still 2 minutes left. If you have any questions to ask, you can put it up. You can also send us questions and we can see if we can get replies later if you hesitate to ask them now. I will put up some of the learnings that I've captured onto LinkedIn for all of y'all to see and for the world at large to see. And once again, thank you very, very much. It was a pleasure hearing you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bhagat.
Thank you. Thanks, Mamta. And the couple of questions which have come in late, I'm going to make note of them and I'll put up a post on LinkedIn that gives a more thoughtful response. So if you have anyone who's putting up questions even now, that's fine. You have my email address. I know I'm always someone who thinks of questions much after the class. So feel free. Whatever questions I get, I will put them up in a LinkedIn post. If I can't answer them, I'm also going to say that, listen, I don't know what the answer to that is, but wherever I can, I'm going to share whatever my best understanding is. So with that,
thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.